Hi, I'm Arnie Gunderson from Fairwinds, and it's Tuesday, July 19th. Today I plan to talk about the condition of the reactors at Fukushima, and more importantly, the radiation that's been detected throughout Japan, not just on the site. And finally, I want to talk about a condition that the Japanese are beginning to call black rain. Well, the first thing is the condition of the site itself. All three Fukushima reactors that were running, 1, 2, and 3, and the fuel pool on Unit 4 continue to release radiation. Now, you don't see it in the day because the days are warm now, but you do see it at night. And I've gotten many, many emails about this where people think that the site is blowing up. In fact, it's steam coming out of these reactors and hitting cold air from the Pacific. So they continue to release radiation. But most of the radiation from Fukushima was released in March and in April. At this point, there's a lot less radiation every day than there was in March and April. About 90 to 95% of the radiation from Fukushima was released in the first 6 weeks of the accident. While it continues to release radiation, there's nowhere near as much on a daily basis. On the other hand, Fukushima may be continuing to release radiation for a long time. Well, the Japanese are building large tents to put over each of these reactors. The first tent is in fabrication now, and it will cover reactor 1, and then they'll move to reactor 2 and reactor 3, and finally reactor 4. Those tents are designed to prevent the steam from getting out and to collect it as water and treat it. So beginning in September, most of the airborne radiation will be eliminated from Fukushima, at least from Unit 1. And more, though, will wind up with the contaminated groundwater and the contaminated liquids that are on site. And there's nothing in the foreseeable future to eliminate those. As a matter of fact, the Japanese announced that it's going to be 10 years before they begin to remove those cores from the bottom of the containment. There's no technology right now to remove them. Remember, they've melted through the nuclear reactor and they're lying on the floor of the nuclear containment. And now at 3 Mile Island, they had melted onto the bottom of the reactor, but not through the reactor. So this is brand new. And you know, it's sort of like trying to peel an egg off the bottom of a frying pan. If it's cooked too long, it's a very, very complicated and difficult process. And that's what we're facing at Fukushima in the long-term cleanup. So in the meantime, there'll be an awful lot of liquid radioactive waste that will have to be processed for 10 or perhaps 20 years. Well, in my mind, the more concerning thing is the information that's been coming in from off-site lately. Some friends of mine are biologists that had worked at Chernobyl and went to Japan to do some scientific work over there. They went anticipating things were going to be bad. I got a call this week from them, and they said, you know, things are really, really bad. So these are hardened scientists who are used to dealing with radiation, and they believe that conditions at Fukushima are much worse than they had thought. Now, there's some corroborating evidence that's come in on that. The first is that mushrooms about 30 miles from the reactor, between 30 and 40 miles from the reactor, are found to be contaminated well in excess of what the Japanese are allowing. Now, the interesting part of that is that the mushrooms were grown indoors. So how can a mushroom grown indoors exceed the radiation standards that the Japanese have set? It's a major concern. And again, it's 35 miles from the accident. The second piece of corroborating evidence is that cattle have been contaminated throughout the Fukushima prefecture and beyond. In the last week, at first it started that 8 cows were contaminated, and then it became 40 cows, and now it's over 130 cows that are contaminated. And I'm sure that number will go up as time goes on. Now, there's a couple interesting things here. First is that the cows were 30 to 40 miles from the reactor, and their cesium levels are well in excess of anything anyone has ever approved for human consumption. Now, when the cows got to market, the Japanese didn't sample the meat. They rubbed the hide of the cow to see if there was any contamination. And based on rubbing the hide of the cow, they released it to market. It was only after that that it was discovered that the meat was contaminated. That's not an acceptable way of measuring beef. But the more important issue here is that how did the cows pick up that contamination when everyone thought the cows were being fed silage? In other words, straw that had been saved from before the accident. Well, it turns out that the Japanese use rice, the stalks of rice, to feed their cows. And farmers out at 45 miles and beyond were cutting their rice stalks down and shipping it into the farms that were inside the Fukushima prefecture. And the straw was contaminated to 500,000 disintegrations every second in a kilogram of straw. Now, this is cesium. It's got a 30-year half-life. But 30 years from now, it's still going to be disintegrating at 250,000 disintegrations per second. And 30 years after that, at 125,000 disintegrations per second. That's what this term half-life means. Now, this occurred out at 45 miles. You'll recall the Nuclear Regulatory Commission suggested evacuation out beyond 50 miles. And this appears to indicate that the NRC was right. The Japanese should have evacuated their population out beyond 50 miles and instead stopped at around 12 to 18 miles. Now, this contamination then has spread beyond the Fukushima prefecture, yet the prefecture itself seems to be the only place that the Japanese are worried about this radioactive exposure. The last thing I'd like to talk about today is what happens outside the 50 miles that we've just been talking about. It's already pretty clear based on the radiation in the straw that we